April 20th marks Behavioral Health Today's third anniversary. To celebrate our third-year mark, we're releasing 5 shows this week, 1 episode each day. 2 will be brand new shows, and 3 will be some of our favorites from the past year. We hope you enjoy all of them, both new and old, and we look forward to another year of bringing you trending and relevant content in behavioral and mental health.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Taylor. My guest today is Darryl Stickel. Darryl is one of the world's leading experts on trust. Darryl is an executive coach with over 20 years of experience focused on the construct of trust. As a founder of Trust Unlimited, Darryl teaches trust through masterclasses, small group learning, and one-on-one coaching. In June of 2022, Darryl published his book, Building Trust: Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. Today, we're talking about building trust in his work as the founder of Trust Unlimited. Darryl, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Graham. It's such a pleasure to be here.
It's really nice to have you. You know, Darryl, this construct of trust, trustworthiness, I don't believe there's a more important, more foundationally essential virtue or character trait for someone to possess or for us to have relationally with one another. Of all the areas that you could have focused on in your career, why trust, and how has trust been such a meaningful part of your life?
Yeah, it's a great question, Graham. And partly the answer comes from some of the struggles that we're seeing in the world today.
Mm-hmm.
We see, well, I call them big, hairy problems, things like climate change, race relations. We're seeing an epidemic in mental health. We're seeing challenges around the pandemic. All of these things require collective collaborative action, and trust levels are at the lowest we've ever seen. And I got started down this path. I was born and raised in a small town in northern British Columbia, in northern Canada, and it was pretty isolated. And so there was this sense of community that we had to pull together. And then, I had a tumultuous childhood and early adulthood, lots of trauma and challenges, taught me a sense of empathy for others. And when I moved to Victoria to go to university, I'd find myself sitting on the bus and somebody would just sit down next to me and say, I'm really having a hard time. So for some reason, people opened up to me in a way that they didn't seem to with others. And part of me thought, if this is going to keep happening to me, maybe I should get paid for this. And so I started down a path towards clinical psychology. And so I was working with families in crisis and troubled teens and working on crisis lines and honing some of those skills so I'd be the best possible candidate for a clinical psych program. But partway through, I just realized that a lot of the population I was working with were really just doing the best they could. And they couldn't get from A to B. And I thought, this is going to drive me insane. And so I shifted into public administration and started working in native land claims. I was doing my master's degree in public admin. And as a research analyst, they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us? And I thought, well, that's a good question. And it got me thinking about long-term disputes and the challenges that we face. And so I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. And when I left Duke, I ended up working for a big management consulting firm. And they said, wow, you got really good client hands. Let's send you to the worst places possible. And so I got a chance to apply the concepts that I'd been theorizing about. And then in 2001, I was involved in a car accident on my way to a client site. Cab I was in rear-ended another vehicle. I ended up with post-concussion syndrome. And so I ended up not being able to work 80 to 100 hours a week anymore. And so I started my own little company called Trust Unlimited. And I've spent the last 20 years helping people understand what trust is, how it works, and how to build it.
Really good. Really good. So what trust is and how it works, set a kind of a foundational understanding of this, operationalize this for us. What are we talking about when we're referring to trust?
So trust for me and for a number of folks is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. And I know a lot of your listeners are therapists or folks who are involved with mental health in some way. This is pertinent to them for a few reasons. One is that the research suggests that a huge portion of their effectiveness is actually determined by the nature of the relationship they build with their customers, with their clients, but also for their clients to be more successful in life. We find that higher trust levels, being able to build trust, leads to more effectiveness for leaders, for couples, for parents, for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in shorter supply now. And so, particularly when we're talking about the epidemic of mental health, people are feeling overly vulnerable. And so, for me, trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. When we're deciding whether to trust somebody, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first is, how likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability. And those things multiply together. So it's uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And so if we go beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do. And so building trust becomes an exercise in understanding, where does uncertainty come from? How do I take steps to reduce it? Where do perceptions of vulnerability come from? And how do I help take steps to manage that for somebody else? And so for me, I think there are 10 levers that we can pull to build trust.
If I could hold that just for a second, I know you've got a really solid approach to helping folks through what some of those are. And I want to come to that if we can. I think you got some top, 10 options that build trust, and some of the traits of trustworthiness. If you'd allow me just to kind of take what you're saying right here first, because I think it's really rich with some good information. Trust is risky. It involves uncertainty. It involves vulnerability. If we go back, it goes back to our, when you're talking about trust, I think of Erickson's stage of psychosocial development and his application business and his generalization of life. And he's saying that to become fully functional, confident members of society, we must successfully complete each stage and resolve two conflicting states like trust versus mistrust, or the second stage, autonomy versus shame. And when we're successful in these developmental stages, we acquire these basic human virtues and a healthy, personality overall, and we become well-adjusted and better prepared for the challenges of life, individually or in families or in business. Like, you're generalizing all of these to be based on trust. But failure, on the other hand, leads to this difficulty of navigating our future, and it truly has a profound impact on our sense of self and impacts our relationships. So you're starting with the very first developmental milestone period that we're born into. We come into the world and having to build a basic trust versus mistrust as the cornerstone, the earliest developmental stage that leads to, ideally, this virtue of hope and the sense that whatever crisis we meet, there's going to be someone around to provide some support or leadership, and we can maybe do that ourselves. But trust is the cornerstone of everything. If it's laid properly, everything lines up plumb. If it doesn't, things become uncertain, things become vulnerable, and trust becomes a genuine risk, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that's a very good insight, Graham. It's so foundational to almost everything that goes on for us.
Yeah.
And, we've seen research that tells us that societies function better when trust levels are higher. There's higher economic growth, there's higher returns to shareholders, there's higher employee engagement, higher job satisfaction. I mean, it's just, the virtues are so profound.
It's so slam dunk. I mean, it's just so basic when you put it like that. Why would it not be something we can build good things on if I can trust that what I'm going to step onto or give my heart to or give my trust to or dedicate myself to isn't going to have some good returns on the investment that I make given my trust.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you're indicating, though, is that, again, it's risky. It's uncertain. It involves vulnerability. Put those two together, you can determine the risk level. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing that we face either today, or why is there such a historic low in our trust levels? How come?
Well, and you're getting to the heart of what really troubles me is that this stuff is so valuable and so important. And I feel like I have an answer for how to help build it.
Yeah.
But I'm a voice crying out in the wilderness, right? And so it's trying to get the signal through the noise. Why trust levels are so low right now is if we think about that formula, uncertainty times vulnerability equals risk. Well, our vulnerability hasn't really gone down, but our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place. And, if we think about early in relationships, uncertainty is high, which means we can only tolerate a small range of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
As that relationship gets deeper, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow to still fit beneath that threshold.
Mm-hmm.
And in deep relationships, we've got really compressed uncertainty, which means there's a huge range of vulnerability that we can tolerate and still trust that other person.
Yeah.
And if we think about what's been going on for the last decade, there's massive mistrust in government, in public agencies, in media. It's because uncertainty has been so pronounced.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're seeing this mental health epidemic right now because the rules have changed so quickly.
What do you mean by the rules?
Well, if we think about the pandemic, we had different rules in different countries,
Right.
different regions, different
Right.
organizations.
Right.
And the rules changed over time as we came to understand the virus more fully. And there was so much noise in the system.
Yeah.
People didn't know who to listen to or who to believe. And so that promotes a pretty profound spike in uncertainty.
Yeah.
At the same time, our social norms are evolving and changing probably faster than they ever have.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that that's either a positive or a negative. I'm just saying it promotes uncertainty for us. And so it makes it harder for us to really have a good sense of what the rules are. And when I think about being a parent, I've written about parenting, I've written about leadership, I've written about trust with the police. I worked with the Canadian military trying to help them build trust with the locals in Afghanistan.
Mm.
This model holds across all these different settings
Mm.
because it gives us a framework to think about
Really good.
where's the uncertainty coming from?
Really good.
Where's the vulnerability? And as I said, our vulnerability hasn't gone down. Maybe it's actually ticked up a notch, and our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place. And so we need to be more thoughtful, more intentional about how we communicate. The things that made a great leader a decade ago are not the same that make a great leader today.
Is that because of what you just referred to a moment ago about the rules?
Yeah.
What are the rules? And when you refer to rules, what are you referring to, and who sets these?
So a lot of times it's the context. I talk about the context, which is something that most of the trust literature doesn't talk about. And so there's these informal and formal mechanisms of social control that constrain our behavior. A lot of times when I'm working with groups, I'll say to them, if you could be anywhere, doing anything with anyone right now, how many of you would be sitting here listening to me? Now, I stopped doing that, Graham, because it's not good for my self-esteem. But
I've been there.
but the question becomes like, why are you here then? Right?
Yeah.
Well, you're here because of the context. You're here because your boss told you had to be, or there's a degree you're trying to complete, or you've got some other problem that's nudging at you that you want to solve.
Mm.
And so the context actually really determines our behavior in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great deal of talk about the individual elements of trustworthiness, but if we're able to actually tell people how we're constrained, it starts to reduce their uncertainty about us. It starts to make it easier for them to predict how we're going to act and what good looks like for us. I think about a doctor's office. You go into a doctor's office, they tell you to take off your clothes, and you do, right?
Yeah.
I've tried that in other places, Graham. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work real well. No.
Not real well. I tell people I'm a doctor, and
and that's when your
and
trust insurance company comes after you and says, "Hey,
stop that."
what are you
And
doing?"
if we actually just change the example from a doctor's office to a bathroom at a gas station, you could have the same people in the same clothes with the same conversation, and it would go from credible to creepy in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
And so including the context allows us to understand why we trust some people without knowing them, or distrust certain people without knowing them. So there are rules that govern our behavior.
Right.
And those rules seem to be a moving target now.
So let me jump in on that piece. I love your mind, and I love the way that you kind of go to the more nuanced pieces of this. So why is that so? How come?
Well, because some of the rules that we had before weren't serving us or didn't serve us more broadly. And we're starting to realize that some people who are very nostalgic about the way things used to be.
Sure.
But when we look back, a lot of times those rules don't play well. There's technological change that's changing the way that we engage with the world. You know, we have conversations about community, and historically, community was predetermined by geographic location. That's not the case anymore.
Right.
And so now our attention span is a mile wide and an inch deep.
Yeah.
And so those communities tend not to be as resilient as they used to be. You don't get the benefit of the doubt the way that you may once have. You don't get the opportunity to fail and learn from that and evolve and grow in a way that you may have before. And so there's a number of forces pushing at these things that drove people to want to be leaders in the past have shifted and changed. Talk to people, Graham, would you want to be president of the United States and watch your family get thrown under the bus the way that seems to lead to, or put them at risk like some political leaders are? There's a lot of times the incentive structure seems to be aligned to promote people who are more self-involved into those roles. And the demands on leaders are growing at such a traumatic rate that it's almost an impossible task for someone who wants to have a balanced life, who cares deeply about others. And so we're seeing the rules act as a disservice to us rather than a service. And we're trying to find a way to alter that as a society. But we don't have a collective conversation about what good looks like.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Nearly 9 in 10 registered voters believe the nation faces a mental health crisis, according to a new USA Today Suffolk University poll. Americans are more concerned than ever about their mental health. Mental health first aid provides the resources and training to identify, understand, and respond to signs of mental health and substance use challenges. It provides the confidence and skills needed to offer life-saving assistance, and it provides peace of mind. Our experts provide mental health first aid training for adults, teens, caregivers, veterans, law enforcement, EMS, and school faculty. Mental health concerns are on the rise, but evidence-based training through mental health first aid can make a difference. Visit mentalhealthfirstaid.org to find a course near you, or email hello@mentalhealthfirstaid.org to schedule a training. Courses are available for individuals, groups, organizations, and companies of all sizes. Visit mentalhealthfirstaid.org and make a difference in your community.
I like that piece right there. In the absence of what good looks like, I think of family systems,
Yeah.
We have systems wherever we go in our families, in our communities, in our state, in our nation. Systems are systems, and we need good leaders who are ideally, let's use a family as an example, the parents parent selflessly for the interest of the family first and foremost. And they recognize the uncertainty, they recognize the vulnerability, and they take that into consideration. And they are selfless and servant leading their families in such a way that they build all of these healthy developmental milestones, from trust that allows autonomy, that allows initiative, that allows industrious, qualities in their kids, and a solid identity. And they develop intimacy later on in their lives. They become generative in the things that they do. And it just builds and builds and builds and builds upon one another. And the idea that if one system like this could do it in the context of a family, why couldn't we do this in a larger way?
Yes.
Within the context of our nation, where we had the parents at the helm in a selfless role, where there's nothing that's about their gain, but we all gain when we make things more certain. We embrace vulnerability and we build these very trustworthy relationships and these programs, whatever else is going to be. And man, imagine how we could grow if that could be in place.
We can, though. This is the frustration for me, is that building trust is a skill that we can build, right? And we can be better at this, but we need to be intentional. And a lot of times it means we need to have a shared vocabulary. And when I talk to parents, one of the levers I talk about is benevolence, having someone else's best interest at heart.
Yes, very good.
And when I am standing in front of a group of parents, I'll say, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And all the hands go up. And when I flip that question, I say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third, and it's somewhat hesitant, right? And so if we're not making it land in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, then how do leaders do this? How do they promote this sense of benevolence? And partly it's because we're making assumptions about others. We interpret the world through stories. We're not sharing the narrative well. I have a fantastic relationship with my sons. They're 21 and 18. They mean
Nice.
more than me than anything.
Mhm.
And, I talk to parents about a command and control style versus a relational style of parenting. And, when my oldest was 12 years old, he looked at me one day and he said, "Dad, I know you're all about what's best for me. Even if you're upset with me or annoyed or frustrated, I know it's about what's best for me." And that's what winning looks like.
That must have been a nice moment.
That was a fantastic moment. And it means that my sons give me the benefit of the doubt.
Yes, there's
They
some
interpret
grace
my
there.
actions in the most
Yeah.
positive possible way,
Yeah.
because they know that I care about them and I actually communicate to them.
Yeah.
I include them in the conversation.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we're trying to be benevolent in a parenting setting, we're thinking about today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, but our kids are thinking about right now.
Mhm.
And what we need to be able to do is come alongside them and help them be successful in the moment,
Mhm.
so that we earn the right to talk about success in the future.
I love where you're leaning in that, because I think trust is something that we have to earn, and we need to be responsible for the earning of it. You're
Yeah.
talking about concepts of, promoting benevolence. You're talking about wanting to land this message of trust. Let's shift now back into what you introduced earlier in the show about how you build the kind of your formula for building trust, the
Right.
process that you take folks through. Share that with
Yeah.
us.
So I have a very systematic, practical, applied approach to helping people understand what trust is and how it works.
Mhm.
And so within uncertainty, I ask myself, where does uncertainty come from? If part of the role for us to build trust is reducing uncertainty, where does it come from? And partly it comes from me as an individual, and partly it comes from the context that we're embedded in. And most of the literature, 95% of the literature focuses on those individual characteristics.
Yeah.
There was a great article written by a friend of mine in 1995 that talked about trustworthiness. His name's Roger Mayer, if folks want to look him up.
Mhm.
And he proposed 3 elements that drove perceptions of trustworthiness, and those were benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is that belief you've got my best interest at heart and that you'll act in my best interest. Integrity is, do I follow through on my commitments, and do my actions line up with the values that I express? And ability is, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm going to do? And then the context are the formal and informal mechanisms of social control that constrain our behavior. And so we can be active across all 4 of those levers, because we all have the ability to build trust. Some are
Yes.
better than others, right? Those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull. And usually it's the ability lever. I have this much experience, these kinds of credentials,
Right.
this role within the organization. And so we pull that lever over and over again.
Yeah.
Those who are better have multiple levers that they pull. Those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one.
Mhm.
So if I'm pulling the ability lever and you don't think I have your best interest at heart, there's a gap in benevolence.
Yes.
I miss. Right. And so it's all about trying to improve people's batting average.
Great.
And so what I do is I systematically walk through and show people the levers and talk them through how to pull each lever. And that's what I've done, in the book that I wrote and in the courses that I do. I get people to practice these things, because so often the training that we do is fire and forget. We show people concepts and then just hope that they figure it out.
Mhm.
But the approach that I take is here's the lever, here's how it works. Now here's how to pull it. And so, one story that I like to tell is about my youngest son, Alexander. And I was in a parenting course. I was helping to co-lead the parenting course, and Dr. Allison Reese was leading it. And she was talking about traits and the fact that often they're not intentional, they're not, within our control. They're part of who we are. And there's positive and negative attributes associated with these traits. And my youngest was highly distractible. And the positive elements of that trait are that he's, funny, he's engaged, he cares about people, he notices things, he's curious about the world. The negative element was that he's late. He misses things, he gets distracted. And so he was young, he was probably 11, 12 years old. And I'm waiting for him to come out after school. And he's later than normal, right? Like all the other kids have come out, the teachers have come out, the janitor's trying to lock up, and he's dragging his feet. And we get a limited amount of time together, right? Because
Right.
my ex-wife and I had split up, and so there's some anxiety for me. And as he's approaching, I'm thinking about this fact that this is not his intent,
Mhm.
right? This is just part of who he is.
Mhm.
And I have the choice in this moment to either be angry and frustrated and give him crap for being late, which is what everyone has been doing. And it's not changing the behavior.
Sure.
Or I can love and accept him for who he is, all that he is. And so he approaches me and he says, his head's down, he's dragging his feet. He says, "I'm really sorry I'm late." And I looked at him and I said, "Buddy, you're worth the wait."
That's
And
lovely.
I said, "Whoever comes next can wait. Nothing's more important than you." And it was such a relief for him.
What'd you see on his
That-
face?
Just such a feeling of gratitude and acceptance that he was experiencing.
Yeah.
It was a change moment for our relationship. It was a transitional moment for our relationship
Yeah.
because everyone had been yelling at him about this.
Yeah.
And I knew that if he had control over it, he would have exerted that. And this was something he was learning to cope with. And we had another conversation because my sons are different. They're 3 years apart. My older son was really engaged in sports, and it's something that I enjoyed as well. And my younger son said to me, "Dad, I'm sorry I'm not more like Thomas."
Mm.
Because it's so easy for you guys to have conversations about some of the things you have shared interests in. And I said, "Buddy, I spend zero time wishing you were someone else.
Mm.
I wouldn't change you. I love you for who you are and all that you are." And so that's what benevolence starts to look like.
Right.
And, for some of my students, they'll ask the question, how do I even start? Well, I give people a template. I give them a template for a conversation because these are often muscles that they haven't exercised before.
Right.
And so when it comes to the benevolence conversation, I'll say, you're going to have a conversation with someone. You're going to say, "I heard this guy, Darryl, he was talking about trust. He said benevolence is really important, and that's having someone's best interest at heart." And I think I do that, but it doesn't always land that way.
Mm.
Do you ever experience that? And everyone's experienced that, for the most part. And so they'll say, "Yeah, I did this, or I did this other thing. I had best intentions." Then you start to narrow the funnel a bit. And you say, "Have you ever had someone really have your back? What did they do? What did it look like? How did it feel?" And now you're priming them and you're getting hints about what benevolence looks like for them.
Mhm.
And then you narrow the funnel further and you go, "What would it look like if I was benevolent to you?
Mm.
What does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? What matters most to you?"
Mm.
And now we've created this moment where we can be transparent.
Man, that's
And-
really good. Continue.
And now later on in conversations, we can say, "Remember when you told me this is what mattered to you?
Mhm.
This is me trying to do that." And so we take some of the noise out of the system. We create the opportunity to have a shared narrative about why I'm doing some of the things I'm doing. My oldest wanted to get a baseball scholarship. And he said, "This is my dream." And I said, "Okay, so that means that you need to eat well. You need to exercise. You need to work on your skills and practice hard. You need to be a good teammate. You need to do well in school. If that's your goal, then these are the things that you need to do to get there."
Mhm.
And now all of a sudden I'm coming alongside him and he feels like it's benevolence rather than nagging
That's right.
when I'm asking him questions about those things. His story, his interpretation is different.
I love that theme of coming alongside as a leader. And it's, sometimes we nudge and sometimes we direct and lead, but once things get set up, coming alongside becomes such a nice relationship. And in both of those stories, you're pulling some really nice levers,
Yeah.
with your youngest son around that of, just giving him some grace about being late and letting him know that his self-worth is not based on his timeliness to you. In fact, everybody else is probably giving him some heat around that. In that moment, you give him really kind of what's referred to at times as a corrective emotional experience, that I'm
Yeah.
loved just for who I am, even if I can't, check all the boxes or do all the things right to keep people happy around me. My dad loves me nonetheless, and he wouldn't rather be with anybody else but with me in this moment, regardless of my
Yeah.
timeliness. And I love that. You're talking about these traits, Darryl, around trustworthiness and these 10 options to building trust. Can you go a little bit more just into that? We got a handful of minutes left, but just go just a
Sure.
little bit more into these options and the traits of trustworthiness for us, if you would.
So the 4 levers are, within uncertainty. There's 2 levers within vulnerability, right? So understanding what the other person thinks is at stake and how they value it.
Mm,
And then also understanding their context. So you understanding my context reduces your uncertainty about me. Me understanding your context informs me about how you're vulnerable, what your options are, what your choices are.
got it.
After we've made the trust decision, there's a perceived outcome. And we can have the same experience and dramatically different perceptions.
Mhm.
And so within the perceived outcome, there's 2 levers. And one of those is, do we create a shared narrative about what happened? And even better, do we create a shared understanding of what good looks like, a good outcome looks like
Mm,
before we start,
very good.
so that there isn't the risk of us having different perceptions of what a good outcome looked like?
That's really a cornerstone in itself, isn't it? It's like, where are we going? What's it going to look like? How are we going to know? And what are some
Right.
of the what are some of the milestones along the way that we could say, hey,
Yeah.
this is lining up correctly. I like that.
So that we're all putting our energy in the same direction, right?
Mhm.
I mean, how often has
That's
someone said,
right.
well, wow, if I knew that that's what
Right.
the rules were, I would have acted differently.
Yeah.
And then in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we
Yeah.
like or dislike someone else. So 99.9% of the trust research treats people like they're rational actors. And I don't know if you've met people before, but we're not always rational, right?
No way.
And so this was at the heart of these sort of long-term disputes, is we're taking cognitive rational approaches to profoundly emotional problems.
Mhm.
And so if we like people, we tend to have a positive perception of them. We look for reasons to trust them. We're more likely to trust them. We're more likely to see the outcome as positive. It creates this virtuous cycle. If we don't like people, we look for reasons not to trust them. We've got this negative story about them. We
Sure.
search for reasons. We're more likely to see the outcome as negative, to blame
Mhm.
it on them.
Mhm.
And then it creates this vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And the more extreme those emotional states become, the less rational we are.
Very good.
And so that needs to be the place where we intervene first, to try to reset those emotional states before we start pulling these cognitive rational levers. So there's 4 levers in uncertainty, 2 in vulnerability, 2 in perceived outcomes, and 2 in the emotional states.
Got it.
So much of that is outside of what the original trust literature talked about. No one talks about emotions and relationships
Yeah.
and the impact it has. There's not a lot of talk about context. There's very little talk about vulnerability, which means we can't talk about depth of relationship. And there's not a lot of talk about perceived outcomes.
When I hear that vulnerability piece and you're talking about the emotional states being so involved in the trust building, if you and I are coming together, you've got your story that predates me. I've got my
Yeah.
story that predates, you. But if we're going to work together, we almost have to transcendently move out of your story, my story. And you're giving
Yeah.
people a really nice kind of GPS path, pathway of how to transcend and almost create a third way of being together. Not your story solely, not mine, but one that we begin to share. This
Yeah.
third way of being that allows vulnerability through agreements, through empathy, through, the vulnerability, through clarifying uncertainty, where we're going to be going. That allows that trust to happen. And I think in that moment too, I think that can be corrective for those that have had really difficult
Yeah.
times with trust being, betrayed or not, to something that they can really feel safe in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's clear that you're skilled at this, Graham, because that's exactly what I do. When you write a PhD about building trust in hostile environments, people call you when things are hostile.
All right.
And so what I've done in the past with the folks who are in dispute is I sat down with the first party and said, what's your story?
Mm,
How'd we get here? What's happened? And then
nice.
I separately sit down with the second party and say, what's your story? What's happened? How'd we get here? And then I bring them together and I say, okay, person 1, tell me person 2's story.
Mm,
So it provokes that empathy.
nice.
And it gives the other person a chance to correct misperceptions.
Mm.
And they start creating it's part of the exercise of creating a shared narrative of what's going on, what happened,
Yeah.
how did that impact you? And then I get the second person to tell me the first person's story. And all of a sudden, we're starting to create this shared narrative.
That's right. And that's where empathy comes from. You talked about earlier. It's my understanding you.
Yeah.
And as I begin to develop this empathy, I begin to soften. And that softening allows maybe kind of some of the ingredients for this new trust you're trying to build to develop. So yeah, I just really appreciate this. This is such a great topic, Darryl, and you're so clear and methodical. I love the idea that there's this formulaic way of measuring these things, of deciding, are you pulling the right levers at the right time? I like the
Yeah.
idea that you can see, how you can encourage someone to be effective in each of these stages. I know we're kind of winding down today. I want to ask a question just in a moment, but anything you want to kind of capstone around this approach that you have before we move on a little bit?
Trust is a skill we can all build. And one of the challenges I face is that 95% of people believe they're more trustworthy than average.
Yeah, right.
And aside from being statistically impossible, it means that when we actually do recognize a trust problem, we think it's someone else's fault.
Yeah.
And so the objective is no less than making the world a better place. And what I would love is if people, you can go to my website and look in the blog section at the articles, you can buy the book, but apply the concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start getting along better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something we can be intentional about.
Yeah, I really like that. In fact, I was just going to ask you before we close, what is the one thing you'd want our listeners to walk away with from today's show? But you just kind of knocked it out of the park with what you just said right there. So I'm going to stick with that as kind of a nice way to bring this kind of to a close. I want to ask you one other question just before we go. Who's made the biggest impact in your life personally and professionally with regard to trust?
So there's been so many different players that have played a role, both positive and negative. But I got to say, my biggest assistant right now is my guide dog, Drake.
Oh, I got to talk about Drake here, Darryl.
The director of goodness, the DOG
right.
for my company.
The DOG.
Drake helps me navigate the world, and I'm legally blind. And there was a real stretch where I didn't have Drake or a guide dog, and I could feel alone in a crowd because I couldn't see body language. I didn't know who to approach or how to approach them. Who was open, who wasn't. Drake changes all of that. He brings people to us, and he's got such a positive story about everyone. He's so happy to see everyone. He's got a positive narrative about the exchange he's about to have with everyone. If we had his brain chemistry, the world would be a much better place.
Isn't that true? Mm-hmm. That's awesome. For those listening, you can see Drake on the website, and there's a really nice write-up around him as well. And what a lovely companion. And I can truly appreciate the benefit of that trusting relationship. He looks like just a love. And I love the DOG, Director of Goodness, the dog on hand, and what a wonderful pal. Hey, as we wind down today, Darryl, would you give us some resources and ways that we can learn more about you, your company, Trust Unlimited, and your new book?
Yeah, so people can go to the website, trustunlimited.com. They can email me, Darryl@trustunlimited.com, if they want to reach out and have a conversation. I wrote the book because I was having profound impact, but I felt like I was dropping grains of sand in the ocean. And the book is an intent to scale. And so I've put everything there, right? The whole model's there. Talk about how to pull the levers. I tried to make it as transparent and easy to read as possible. It's called Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere you buy books online or on Audible. And they can reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. And I'm really hoping people come alongside and help me pick up great big rocks that we can throw in the water and make a huge splash.
Yeah, Stephen Covey does that experiment where you take the big rocks, the pebbles and the sand, and you put them all in a vase. And if you don't put them in the right order, they won't fit. But if you put the big rocks first, then the pebbles and the sand, everything fits. But if you put them in the wrong order, your big rocks here are truly those developmental milestones that we've got to hit for anything to be possible. Autonomy and being industrious, being generative, developing intimacy, all of these things are predicated upon that big rock of trust, that cornerstone being put into place first. And I can't think of a more healing message for our nation today, our families,
Yeah.
communities, our nation. And the thing that's absent right now that is most felt, that is, I believe, causing the majority of the issues going on, is the absence of trust and the uncertainty that we live in and the vulnerability that we are unwilling to demonstrate and to bring into relationships. So your message, Darryl, is an awesome one. And I so appreciate having you on the show today.
It's been a pleasure being here.
Been a lot of fun, a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here. And I also want to thank you, our listeners, for dropping by and joining Darryl and me today. It's always great to have you with us as well. I want to remind you that today's episode with Darryl and its resources and all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. So check out our webpage, triadhq.com/BHT, and explore our archive of podcasts and other resource materials. Thanks again for being with us on the show, and we'll look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tribe Network, all rights reserved.